We are delighted and honored to have our panel. They are three distinguished Americans, distinguished Asian Americans. I will not go through their full biography. They are in your materials. Very briefly, to my immediate left is the Honorable Elaine Chao, former secretary. The first Asian American woman cabinet member in American history. She served as the 24th U.S. Secretary of Labor from 2001 through 2009. She is now with the Heritage Foundation. We have next to her Neera Tanden, who recently became the president of the Center for American Progress, and she was formerly in the Obama administration, where she served as an advisor to the Department of Health and Human Services, assisting Secretary Kathleen Sebelius. And to the far left is Benjamin Wu, who also was at in the George W. Bush administration. He was at the U.S. Department of Commerce, and he is the past president and now the vice chair of the U.S. Asia Institute. So let me start by asking each of you, we've put out a very thick report. We did a little summary of some of its findings. It's both the demographic and economic and socioeconomic characteristics, attitudes, values of a population that, as we've described, is now nearly 6% of the U.S. population, and in terms of recent immigrant arrivals, is now the largest stream of new arrivals in this country. Your general thoughts, both from your professional career and perhaps your own personal journeys, as to what this report is telling us about Asian Americans.
I'm the good little child. I was told to prepare 5 minutes of remarks, which of course I did. Very emblematic in many ways. But first of all, I'm just so delighted to see that this comprehensive seminal study on Asian Pacific Americans has been undertaken by the Pew Research Center. Pew is very well known for its seminal work on major issues in our society, and I think it is quite significant that this organization has deemed it important to do a study on an emerging group, the Asian Pacific American group in America. I mean, basically, Americans of Asian descent. Now, I came to America as an immigrant myself decades ago. I arrived on these shores when I was 8 years old, not speaking a word of English, with my 2 sisters and my mother. We were joining my father, who had come to America about 3 years earlier to seek a better life for our family. And so our family was separated for 3 years, and again, it was quite emblematic of the times that there would be separations, but that families who were reunited were so blessed to be in this country. At that time, America was not as diverse as it is today. The majority of people here were white and African American, with Hispanic and Chinese or Asian residents or people being viewed as rather exotic entities. The race debate was viewed primarily as black and white, and that was how life was. Well, fast forward to where we are today and what this survey tells us. And it's amazing that now Hispanics are about 17% of the population, African Americans about 12% of the population, Asian Pacific Americans are now nearly 6% of the total US population, and the white population has dropped down to about 63.3. What I found most interesting about the study was 3 things that characterize the Asian Pacific American community. And these 3 things are basically hard work, family, and education. And in many ways, these were the traditional American values, which made America great as well. And as a former Secretary of Labor, I found these education level attainments among the Asian Pacific American community especially interesting, because America is now an increasingly high-skilled economy, where the majority of the new jobs being created require higher skills and more education. And there is a direct correlation between educational attainment, educational levels, and the unemployment rate. So for example, the national unemployment rate is now at 8.2%. If you are a college graduate, your unemployment rate, and I'm going to have to refer to this past month was about, let me see here,
Oh, get it.
about, right, it's
4%,
right,
I
3.9%. Neera is helping me here. For those with only a high school degree, it's 8.1 unemployment rate, so it goes up. And for high school dropouts, they suffer about a 13.1 unemployment rate. The latest Asian American unemployment rate, this is a group with the highest education, is basically 5.2%. And so for the future, for an economy that bodes, that requires higher skills, I think Asian Pacific Americans are very well positioned. That's not to say that there are no issues. There are many new immigrants. This is still a primarily majority foreign-born population, and they face issues of concerns about survival in this new country, concerns about cultural assimilation and language facility. And I think this study, once again, shows a very multifaceted and a deep look at this community. But I would say this is only a first step, and that more work needs to be done. And I would also say to the Asian Pacific Americans who are here and they're struggling to make a life for themselves and their family, we have so much to offer to mainstream America. We should not hesitate, nor should we be afraid to offer our point of view and also our many attributes which I think mainstream America can certainly benefit from. And that's, again, emphasis on family, emphasis on education. And again, I just feel as if there's so much that we can share. We've contributed a great deal to this country. And going forward, we're an increasingly larger, more significant part of this country. And we should feel very confident in partaking of the process, the community life, as well as the political life and social life of America in every aspect. So thank you.
Neera Tanden?
Thank you.
Thoughts?
And it's my honor to be here with Ben Wu and Elaine Chao. And I just want to say one thing that I think has been interesting over the last couple of years is that we've seen more Asian Americans take leadership roles in public policy and in governance, which has not been the case when I was a child. There were no Asian Americans in any federal offices at a high level. And I want to thank Elaine Chao for her leadership as a cabinet secretary, because she also helped pave the way for many people with the path that she's blazed. So let me just say a few words to build on Secretary Chao's remarks. I do think that the report is incredibly important, not only in describing Asian Americans, but describing the differences between Asian Americans, between Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans, Indian Americans. And there are other groups within the Asian populations that I hope will get further study in the future. But this is a seminal work in describing these the life that Asian Americans have. And I think back to my own childhood, I grew up in a suburb of Boston. There were no people of color in my small town of Bedford, Massachusetts. We were the only people of color, as it was one family that was Indian. And I do think the story of how America has diversified is an interesting story, and how America has increasingly become a place that welcomes diversity, is a significant story as the world globalizes. And I think what was interesting, an interesting point about this report is that, it's not that Asians in the United States have changed in the last several decades. The world has changed and Asia has changed. When I was a child, both India and China were looked upon as lesser developed countries, third world nations in the common lexicon. I remember feeling not ashamed, but people looking at me as a lucky immigrant to be here in this prosperous country. And the rise of Asia has been a significant one in my lifetime. But I also think the Asian American community can, as other communities, have in their past can be a bridge between Asia and the United States that will be important for America's competitiveness. Now, I think the report has very positive data points about a lot of the characteristics that Secretary Chao discussed. But it is important for us to recognize that there are significant challenges that were perhaps not highlighted in the report, although addressed. There are still challenges amongst Asian communities on high rates of uninsurance. As we discussed the Affordable Care Act, we do face that challenge. We do have long-term unemployment challenges, specifically amongst particular populations of Asian Americans, but it is something that we are all troubled by. And I do think we need to have, I think it's important to have a balanced approach. We should celebrate the successes of the Asian American community and positive attributes of the community. And I do think it's important that when people look at the promise of America and the American dream, that we have a picture of it representing all communities. And I think what's valuable about this report is that it demonstrates that immigrants are having an incredibly positive contribution to our economy and to America's growth. But we should also have a full picture of the challenges immigrants face, still with discrimination and other issues that give us a nuanced picture of Asian American community. And I appreciate the profound contribution this report makes in helping all of us better understand the community and the diversity within it and the diversity amongst it. So thank you.
Benjamin?
Well, Paul, thank you for allowing me to be part of this distinguished panel. I have a very similar background to Secretary Chao. I came here as a young child from Taiwan, rejoined my parents and reunited with them, who came to study here in the United States. And the survey findings, to me, resonate so much with my personal life as well as the community that I know. So I want to thank Pew and the Pew team, the research team, for an incredible survey that I think will have a lasting impact on the community. Already I think people have ciphered through the data, and many people have already made comments about it. I've received several emails this morning about people who have looked at the press release or have looked at the initial draft and are very interested. So I think that the survey will have a profound effect, and a lot of organizations, a lot of people will probably take what they want out of this survey because it's so voluminous and so comprehensive. I do think, though, that it does paint a very positive picture of the Asian American community and how the Asian American community can be a very significant foundation of the growth and competitiveness of this country. The only aspect that I would caution for those who read the report is that you don't take such a broad brush out of the findings of the report. It'd be easy to say that the report quantifies all Asian Americans as successful, as prosperous, as well-educated, and may not need any assistance in their communities. But what we know from the community is that that's not always the case. For example, my wife and I are on several boards of organizations that serve the greater Washington area in Montgomery County. Montgomery County, Maryland, with Maryland as the highest median income in the country, and Montgomery County is the most prosperous of all of the jurisdictions in the state. Arguably, we are one of the most affluent counties in the country. And yet, we see in Montgomery County great successes, but we also see a community that needs language assistance, housing assistance, and other forms of assistance that charitable foundations, organizations, local communities, churches, and governments that choose to support such charitable organizations shouldn't overlook. And I think that that's important to leave behind also as a takeaway, in addition to all the positive aspects that the report seems to ratify about the community? I know you've got several questions, so let's go at it.
Well, listen, let me start with this. Yesterday, as we put out a press release about this report, I had a lot of interviews with journalists writing about it, and one theme of several of the interviews was our sort of lead news finding, if you will, that among recent immigrant arrivals, Asians have now surpassed Hispanics. And as far as we can tell, that crossover point actually happened 2 or 3 years ago, probably in 2009. And the reporters from the top newspapers sort of said to me what I said to myself when we first found this is, how come no one has told this story before? You know, this is aren't we 3 years late on this story? And in some sense, there's a narrow answer, which is we have Jeffrey Purcell, who can go inside census data in a way that almost no one else can, and we could actually find and quantify that. But I wonder whether it goes to a larger issue, which is there a reticence within the Asian American community about broadcasting success, about telling our story, and that may be born out of a pretty painful 150-year history where it was a community that was racialized, that was treated as other. Now, many of you probably, you know, there was a sort of a break in the immigration streams, but that is certainly the history.
Can I just say, why has not the media noticed this 2-3 years ago? Because they don't notice, they're like lemmings. They go to where they think the big news is. And Asian Americans have heretofore not been a very noticeable part of this society, which is why this study is important.
Well, so, I guess my question is, yeah, I mean, I'm happy to take the rap for you know, for the media. I used to be one, and yeah, I think this was a story that was missed. But I do think that it is a phenomena that has managed to fly under the radar screen for a lot of reasons, and I wonder whether some of the reasons don't emanate from the community itself, where there may be a reluctance to call attention to ourselves. That has not worked well for us over the centuries. I'm putting it.
You know, I would say, look, I think that I have spoken for a long time about the need for Asian Americans to enter public life and to run for office, et cetera. And I think, and we've lagged in many ways in doing that. And I think that is also, there has been, there has been an argument to sort of keep your head down and study hard and succeed in the private sector than the public sphere, because I think there has been concerns, my parents had concerns about racism in America, and that if you called too much attention to yourself, that, you know, people would consider you even more of, you know, for lack of a better term, the other. And you know, after 9/11, we did experience sharp increases in racism in particular subsets of the Asian community and the Asian community writ large. And you know, the Sikh community had lots of incidents of racism, violence, et cetera. And for at least, you know, some sets of the Indian community, it was a reminder that, you know, when you have a break like that, people become look at Asian Americans differently. And so, and you know, I think there has been a lot, you know, there's a lot of intolerance towards immigrants in the political discourse, not Asian Americans versus others, but immigrants. In recent years, there has been a lot of criticism of immigration, attacks on immigrants in the political discourse. You know, 5 years ago, President Bush, a Republican, was talking about comprehensive immigration reform. The last several years, parties have really shifted and polarized on that issue. So I would say that, I don't want to read too much into this, but I would say that there has been a reticence amongst parts of the Asian community to really enter the political discourse. And we're seeing a rise of a generation of leaders now, but it's taken several generations for that to happen. And I think that is because people have, you know, there has been a concern that Asian Americans are not considered part and parcel of the fabric of the country. I think that has changed, but that has been a concern that I think my parents' generations has had.
I think to be, and Ben, you may want to say something, but I think you also have to be cognizant of the fact that this community was so small.
Yeah,
In 1965, you know, the Asian American community was less than 1%, and now it's 5.8%. So this is an emerging awareness, and it's got, I don't think, anything to do with the reticence of the Asian American community to toot their own horn, though that may be true because culturally that's just not accepted. And I think that's the cultural differences contribute to the difficulties in assimilation. But this is still a very majority farm-born population. And their first concern is to make a living, survive in this country, take care of the kids, put them in the best schools possible. So their focus is very family-oriented. And it is not, you know, it's changing, but traditionally it's not been very much outwardly focused. But nevertheless, you know, where is the press in all of this? I think there is a dearth of coverage of the Asian Pacific American community. And in part, in the past, it was due to the fact that it was such a small community. But now that it's becoming a larger community, we're beginning to see more and more coverage. We're also beginning to see more diversity in newsrooms and deliberate policies to have more diverse individuals on the front pages of newspapers. I mean, all of that is impacting news coverage.
Yeah, let me echo the challenge that Secretary Chao just made. The press, and as a former journalist, I think you can appreciate this, Paul. The press should really try to focus more on the Asian American community because that's where the story is. It's emerging, it's growing, it's going to have an impact. And the press, it may be behind the curve on this. I think having the report helps at least underscore the fact that this is a press-worthy type of information. And you know, whatever generalities there may have been in the past about people who may have been reticent, I can assure you that while there may have been some people, Asian Americans, who were reticent to seek press in the past, there was always a segment of people, Asian Americans, who wanted to get the press. So the attention, you really
that
can't.
makes us like everybody else.
That's it. You can't blame the community. If you want to blame somebody, you should blame the press and the desire for the press to be reactive. And I think there is a prospective, a forward-looking article or series of articles here, and the report can help illuminate that and underscore the need for that. Let me, though, offer an example, though, of maybe some folks who are a little reluctant about pushing the fact that you know, they're a successful Asian American. You know, we have two Asian American governors in the United States, Nikki Haley over in South Carolina and Bobby Jindal over in Louisiana. And both are very effective governors. Both, though, want to be seen as governing for all people. And so for them as politicians, there is a reluctance that they have about trying to portray themselves as Asian Americans. But I can also tell you that both Governor Haley and both Governor Jindal both recognize the historical importance that they have, and they're fully aware of it. And they are, you know, icons in the Asian American community as a result.
Let me shift focus. One story that did get some attention in the press a year or so ago was arising out of the Amy Chua book, Battle Hymn of a Tiger Mother. And you saw we had what we called our Tiger Mom question. You know, do Asian American parents put too much or too little pressure on their children? Do American parents put too much or too little? And we got, I would guess, sort of predictable findings that played to a stereotype, if you will. A stereotype, I guess my question is this a stereotype that the Asian American community should embrace? Because it seems to be supported by the underlying attitudes about hard work, about parenting, et cetera, or are stereotypes per se uncomfortable?
Well, just as a mom of a 9-year-old and a 6-year-old, I want to distinguish between Amy Chua and the idea that we should have our kids work hard. Okay, because I just want to say I believe my kids should work hard and I want them to do well in school, And I still believe that you can have them have happy play dates and watch TV and a whole host of other things. So I just want to separate. As I don't like stereotypes, I don't want Amy Chua to speak for me as an Asian mom either. Much as I like her, and she's a great Yale professor, but still, I think that was an extreme form of parenting that I don't want Asian mothers to own either. I think it's an interesting. My parents, I will say, drove us very hard and would say things about working hard that other parents probably don't say, which is if you don't do well on your test, you're going to be a failure for the rest of your life. And I don't adopt that parenting strategy for my children, and I don't really recommend it for other people either. But I think what is interesting is, and a lot of the findings that are most interesting, I think, in this report are the sort of social findings about how people relate to each other. I thought, the ideas of how Asian Americans feel integrated or welcomed or a part of the American, part of America, not separate from America, was also interesting. But I think there is a strong push within the Asian American community, part of which is being an immigrant community. But it is an interesting part of this discussion.
Ben, did you want to?
Well, I recall my childhood, and my mom laughs today and says, "Oh, well, I was not a tiger mom," but yet, I'm not so sure her recollection is as clear as perhaps mine. I think that what Professor Chao's book and also the findings in the survey shows is that there is a clear priority placed on education in all segments of the Asian American community, and that's always a good thing.
I'll be very frank. My father said to me, "You didn't have a tiger mom, you had a tiger dad." I think what's really interesting is that the Pew Research itself says that Asian Pacific American parents themselves and children say that the Asian parents are a bit too harsh. Mm-hmm. And parents in Asia will say of themselves that the competitive situation in education is too intense and there's too much pressure on kids. And one of the reasons why they find America appealing is because it's better living conditions for the children. That's one point. Second point I would say is the cultural differences I am always harping on, because I think the cultural differences need to be understood more. More and more of these leaders, as Neera mentioned, are Asian Pacific Americans. But the price and the cost, I was a pioneer in so many different ways, and I never spoke to anybody about what it really meant to be culturally different and how much harder I had to work to understand the environment in which I was in so that I can lead others. And I think those cultural issues, such as reluctance to tout one's own achievements, a kind of an anticipation that people kind of understand what you're saying. No, not in this society. You have to be very explicit. So these cultural differences, I think, are also pointed out in this book about different cultural upbringing and what that really means. But I think having discussions like this is very helpful because it does point out that we are a very diverse society, and how do we work with one another and live with one another.
Well, this brings up a quote I pulled from one of the histories we read as we were preparing this, Strangers from a Different Shore by Ronald Takaki, which is a 150-year history of the various streams of immigration from various Asian countries. And he quotes a third-generation Japanese American who heads a major civic organization on the West Coast as follows: "We feel like guests in someone else's house. We can never really relax and put our feet up on the table." This was in the late 80s that he wrote this book, so that's about 25 years ago. We know that a lot has changed. You folks have talked about the change. Is there still something there? Is there still some sense of otherness that you feel imposed upon you, or you're always aware of, or less so now than when you were a kid, or how would you characterize it?
I think your study points that out. Pew study points that out very well. This is a majority immigration, majority foreign-born population. And they have left everything familiar to them to seek their opportunities in a new country. So there's going to be adjustment and adaptation and challenges in assimilation. So, I think those feelings are always, are there. The larger question and the more interesting question is what happens to the second generation, which this study doesn't really talk, or this study touches upon, but does not really conclude, because the majority, the median age of the second generation population in this community, 17 years old. So the chapter is yet to be written, and there are many interesting things about that. But I suspect that that quote is probably more of the sentiment of someone who's new, who's adjusting. I think now, with such larger numbers, I think those feelings of separateness is not as acute as they used to be. But interestingly enough, the second generation feels it. And why do they feel it? Neera and I are going to differ. I think it's this victimization mythology, or this, a lot of these young Asian American kids, they're learning about some aspects of the society which brings out the acuteness of their separation, which it's another topic, which will take a huge amount of time to talk about. But there is two different generations, and so Pew's Center, a research on that second generation will be very, very interesting.
I think the timing of that quote is important. And, when I was growing up, and I would say Indian Americans, my parents would, I think Indian Americans were in some ways held on to cultural cues in a different way. And I mean that, Indian Americans, my mother, women in my family would wear saris, continue to wear saris and salwar kameezes everywhere they went, which was a little unusual when I was growing up. And I felt, Indians have very different, or who are Hindus have very different religious, worship different, have a different religion and worship in a different way. We don't have churches in the same way that Christians do. And so I felt an acute sense growing up of difference than I do now. And again, there was not very many people of color around when I was growing up. But the country, again, has changed dramatically. And I think if you look at attitudes of younger Americans, of 18 to 30-year-olds, and I hesitate to talk about demographics at the Pew Center, which Andy Cohet will correct me in every way that I'm wrong. But generally speaking, my limited understanding of demographics is like 18 to 30-year-olds. 18 to 30-year-old Americans are far more embracing of diversity, embracing of all kinds of diversity, racial, ethnic, gender, sexual orientation, et cetera. So I think that the world that my children are growing up in, they're in a public school here in DC. There's almost every, there's Latinos, African Americans, lots of mixed race kids, much more mixed race kids than were around when I was a child. And so I think the world that they will inherit will be very different. And what is great about America versus other countries, I have uncles and aunts who went to Germany and Ireland, is that our country has embraced diversity in a different way. People haven't had to lose their ethnicity, or haven't felt the pressure to lose their ethnicity, or their racial experience, or their culture or country of origin experience in the same way. And I think as we globalize in the world, that will be something that we thought of as a negative growing up, which is that we're from another country and it wasn't doing so well, is a real positive for our generation. And so I'm optimistic about America and the integration of subpopulations within America, because America has changed because of the immigration that we've had and the Asian Americans that have come to it.
Can I ask a question? One of the things we tried to stress in this report were the differences among different Asian groups, Asian country of origin subgroups. One of those differences emerged from a story just a few weeks ago about a friend of the court brief that was filed on behalf of, I think, 4 different Asian American groups in the leading affirmative action case that is now before the U.S. Supreme Court. And this is a case out of Texas, and it's a challenge to the University of Texas's admissions policies, which have been created in a way to promote diversity, to promote a more diverse student population. And this friend of the court brief was filed by Asian groups that were basically saying we are against affirmative action. We think that any policies along those lines that take you away from anything but strict merit will work to the disadvantage of these high-achieving students from our community. And they are in opposition to other Asian American groups who have traditionally been supportive of affirmative action for the reasons that minority groups are, which is it is a protection. Diversity is a good thing, and this is a way to protect against institutional biases that may exist. In other words, the community itself is divided on a very interesting policy issue. I don't know that we need to resolve the issue right here, but I wonder whether it is an example of the diversity of the community and maybe reflective of some policy challenges that are upon you.
If I can just point out, in this affirmative action debate, we're all in favor of diversity. I think this public policy debate has evolved and has become more complex. For example, in educational institutions, it is the policy of most educational institutions in a drive to promote diversity, to have some, not quotas nor goals, not quotas because they're illegal, but to take race into consideration. So there are numerical guidelines that say that there should be a certain percentage for one racial group, a certain percentage for another racial group, that mirror the national population average. So what some of these Asian American groups are concerned about is that Asian Americans are only 5.8% of the national population. And if these numerical guidelines were implemented, then only approximately 5.8% of Asian Pacific American candidates or people would be deemed to have fit that goal. And so what has evolved in this whole debate now are what's called underrepresented minorities and overrepresented minorities. And Asian Americans are often an overrepresented minority. At Harvard, they're 12% of the population. Some people would think that's a lot. At UCLA, Berkeley, they're well over the majority, and some people may think that's a lot. So they are considered an overrepresented minority, and then you have to kind of look, are there differential guidelines for admissions for an overrepresented minority versus an underrepresented minority? And if there is, there's concern that for Asian Americans who are overrepresented, that they're being disadvantaged. And that's what the debate is all about. Neera will say.
Yeah. Shockingly, I'll disagree a little bit. First of all, I'm not familiar with institutions where the Asian American community is 5.8%, or and there could be numerical guidelines like this, but we haven't seen them anywhere. So I hate to create the specter of Asian Americans becoming only 5.8% of college campuses when we haven't seen it. I'd say my view of this is that education has been the step to a meritocracy in our country, and it's the way people get to the middle class. And I do think I continue to believe that it is critical, I think, for all of our communities that diversity is maintained, for a picture of what America will look like and what America will be like. And it's important that all Americans have a stake in that dream, and that our institutions don't change this. But I think I think when we think about these issues, we should think about broader than just college campuses. Because my experience as an Asian American woman is that there is a lack of diversity in a lot of institutions. A lot of institutions do not have Asian American representation, whether you're looking here in Washington at the Congress or in many of our cabinet secretaries, what the government looks like. We're making progress, but still, we have a long way to go for a lot of institutions, heads of business organizations, CEOs. There's progress we've made, but there are a lot of institutions in our country that don't have the broad swath of Asian American communities at the leadership levels. And I would hate for the Asian American community to think only narrowly about diversity in one institution where we've made significant progress and lose sight of the fact that so many other institutions would benefit from more diversity of Asian Americans. We were just talking about newsrooms a few minutes ago and the importance of having Asian Americans in newsrooms. And for us to lose not a tool here or there, but a commitment to diversity that over the long term will hurt the Asian American community when those norms and values and rules are chipped away at.
Benjamin, is there a so-called bamboo ceiling that operates in different realms of society?
Well, I think some areas certainly need improvement. Corporate boardrooms, for example, need to be more populated with Asian Americans. I think law firms are increasingly accepting more Asian American partners, which is a good thing. So I think you're getting there. I think, Paul, irrespective of the merits of this debate on the affirmative action and also the Supreme Court case, I think what the takeaway is that the Asian American community is not monolithic, and that there is a divergence of views. It used to be, in anything related to civil rights, that it was expected that the Asian American community would march in lockstep with the traditional civil rights organizations and groups representing African Americans, Latinos, and others. To be part of this umbrella civil rights movement. But I think what we're seeing now is a divergence of views, and that people shouldn't just pigeonhole the community into one particular segment. What's interesting about this debate isn't so much about where things fall out, but the fact that the people who are more agitated and more vocal lately about trying to eliminate racial preferences or affirmative action in education seems to be the first generation. Parents of or immigrants who are parents of children who are trying to apply to these schools, who see that they've done very well in school and yet can't get in to either the Ivy League or private school or public school of their choice. And so they're the ones who are most vocal in suggesting that we shouldn't, therefore, be giving biases and preferences over others. We should have a pure meritocracy. And it's that reconsideration of views, I think, from that first generation, I think is probably the most interesting out of this debate. Also, I should point out the other factor that those parents are suggesting is that because educational institutions increasingly have budgetary pressures and the need for greater tuition, that there's an increasing number of international students that are entering into these educational institutions, and as a consequence, the Asian population of a particular school may rise, but the Asian American students may suffer as a result, and so they want to see all of these preferences and biases eliminated so that their kids may be too late if they've already gone through the application process, but their children or grandchildren might be able to have a true meritocracy.
I have one last question, and then we're going to open it up to the floor. And my last question switches the focus to the international arena. As you have already commented, this rising stream of Asian American immigrants, the rising influence of Asian Americans in this country, is it occurring at the beginning of a century where the rise of Asia is going to be a dramatic story, economically, politically, perhaps militarily. who knows? And the nature of the relationship between a rising power or powers and an established power through history has always been fraught. So what does it mean that here in this country, as the established power, wanting good relations with rising powers, we have this growing community? And I would serve up a snapshot that we probably, many of us remember, a very vivid photograph in the newspapers a month or 6 weeks ago. You remember when that dramatic episode was playing out in Beijing just as Hillary Clinton was arriving, and the blind Chinese dissident had sought refuge in the American embassy. And, 2 or 3 days of kind of dramatic negotiations. And he's finally, the negotiations leave the embassy. He's going to be taken to a hospital on a wheelchair. He's broken his foot and making his dramatic escape. And the two gentlemen on either side of the wheelchair as he was leaving the American embassy were Gary Locke, a third-generation Chinese-American who was our ambassador to China, and Harold Koh, second-generation Korean-American who is the senior lawyer for the State Department. And I don't know, I looked at that and I said, that's a good thing, for our country at all sorts of levels. But I don't know whether, as you think about the coming century and the rise of Asia and this community that we're talking about now, what thoughts go through your mind?
And Paul, I should also add that the DCM over in Beijing, Bob Wong, is also a Chinese American.
Yeah.
And so, and he was put in place by Ambassador Huntsman before the president had nominated Ambassador Locke to the position. And so the power of having in China, which is one of our most important bilateral relationships for the United States, to have two Chinese Americans representing the United States is very powerful. And I think the notion of having Asian Americans, speaking personally for me, for Chinese Americans, connected with China, serving as a bridge between the two countries is very important. I'm very pleased to be a member of Committee of 100, and we have our executive director, Angie Tang, here. In Committee of 100, their dual mission is not just on the domestic side, but also on the international side, to serve as a bridge between the United States and China to help resolve and strengthen differences, and I think that the notion of being able to be American, but also have connections with another country can be very helpful in times of difficulty. And we see that those issues flare up in different countries, especially in relation to the United States, bilateral relationships with them. And so as we look into this global century, in which we're interconnected by security, by economy, by trade, having those connections I think is going to be very important. And that's yet another role that Asian Americans can play very significantly to help strengthen the country.
Any other thoughts? Or?
I'll just say one thing, which is, every country has this is an important issue for subpopulations. Every country has a very complicated and different relationship, every Asian country, with the United States. India has had, I like to say the Indian government has a long-term love-hate relationship with the United States. And, for many years, many decades, was trying to maintain a level of neutrality between the Soviet Union, then the Soviet Union, and the United States. And in those times, I think the fact that there were immigrants into the United States served as an important, I hate to use the term, but goodwill ambassadors for the United States. And now, you are seeing a lot of countries that are coping with a singular power world where it is becoming multipolar, and is multipolar, although we're in a transition period that people find difficult to cope with. But I think it is an incredibly valuable thing to the United States and India relationship, that there is a strong Indian community here. I think when I go to India, and my family, I talk a lot about people see the United States in a positive light through my experience, and regardless of the relationship between the governments at any particular time, people, I think, have a much more positive attitude towards the United States because they hear about how it is embracing of Indian Americans And that redounds to the United States' benefit in and I think a relatively profound way that differentiates it from other powers. And I think in a world in which, again, as we're globalizing, economic ties will be more important, political ties will be much more important. I think that the fact, that there are Indian Americans and Chinese Americans, et cetera, is important. But the fact that this country has embraced them means a lot to people in those home countries.
Secretary Chao, any?
Why don't we open it up?
Why don't we open it up to anyone with questions? Again, we have some people with roving microphones. Please let us know who you are, please.
Thank you. Dong Huiyu with China Review News Agency. My question is for Secretary Chao and Mr. Wu. Yesterday, the House passed a resolution of expressing regret for the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. Do you have any comment on this resolution in the context of the growing number of Chinese immigrants or Asian immigrants to these countries? Thank you.
Ben?
Well, I was had a chance to go to the House during the debate of the resolution, and the fact that it also passed the Senate is very significant. It was more than a century ago that Congress, the duly elected body of the people of the United States, passed a very discriminatory law against China and Chinese citizens trying to enter into the country. It went against all the philosophies of liberty and opportunity that this country was founded upon. So it was very significant that the Congress took the step to be able to express regret for the passage of such a law. I think, let's go back to a quote that Paul had read about from Professor Takai. It was 25 years ago, so that was what, 1987. 1987, the Seattle Supersonics were still playing in Seattle. Now they're Oklahoma City. Miami Heat hadn't even been founded yet. Mayor Barry was mayor. Now he's still around, but it's a different position. And the Cosby Show was still on TV. And so much has changed in those 25 years. But one thing that is not going to change is the fact that people are going to be able to take a look at Asian Americans and be able to identify immediately that they're Asian Americans. That's going to go on in perpetuity. And while we've had much evolution and much assimilation and much success since then, the goal of this report, and I think of all future actions, is to be able to have people, when they take a look at Asian Americans, to have them be done in a way that's free of bias and discrimination, and which allows Asian Americans to be cast in a way that is productive and to understand the useful role that they will have in our country. I think that's the responsibility of the press, that's the responsibility of television, the responsibility of other people. But the Congress took a big step also in taking on responsibility for an action that they regretted. And I think that sends a very important symbolic message, not just to the Asian American community, not just to Chinese Americans, but to the country and the world at large.
I agree.
Hi, my name is Gloria Chan. I'm the president and CEO of the Asian Pacific American Institute for Congressional Studies, APACS. And Neera had spoken throughout the day really about the rising numbers and generations of leadership within the Asian American Pacific Islander community. And it's a really great time for the community, not only because of our rise in population, but also our political interests as well. And this year we're seeing over 25 congressional candidates this cycle, which is absolutely historic. Right. So my question for all of you really is, what more can we do as a community all together to make sure that we can capitalize on this growth? How do we continue to encourage more young people to think about public office and serving in government as their careers? Thanks.
Do you want to take that, or?
I think it's positive that more and more candidates are, more and more Asian Americans are considering being candidates. That's what being a part of the civic life and also community life and part of the democracy of this country is all about. I think there are hurdles. Going back to the cultural issues, I think it is difficult. Most Asian candidates will say, I've been persuaded to run by X group. Most mainstream American candidates will say, I want to run for this seat because I think I can do something. So there are cultural issues about raising money, about promoting oneself, and also handling defeat, because there will be defeat at some point unless you're an extraordinarily lucky person. Mm-hmm. And the whole concept about face is very difficult. So I would say, on both sides of the aisle, there are candidate schools. And I think we should encourage more Asian Americans to get more involved in mainstream America in their community life, and through that make the connections with which to have a chance of waging more successful campaigns. And I think that's happening.
And Paul, could I just add that, to Gloria's point, the candidates aren't created in a vacuum. Mentoring is also a very important function, and that's what the Asian American community can do for each other. And I really need to tip my hat to Secretary Chao, who made a point to mentor all of the Asian American appointees in the previous presidential administration, making sure that we had the skills, the network to succeed, not just within the confines of the political arena, but also outside. So mentoring, I think, is very important as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's also, it's important that we celebrate we really celebrate people coming into the process. It is a daunting process. It's important for the community to support candidates, financially and otherwise, and really, I think the thing is that you often see that Asian Americans, they've been more reticent for whatever reason in supporting, getting involved in the political process, voting in the same way that other groups, even much smaller groups, by population, have been very active and have been very effective using their political power, even with much smaller numbers. And so I think this is a constantly reinforcing thing, but it's important for the Asian American community to recognize that part of being American is being involved in the politics of the country. And it's vital that we, leaders, and I celebrate Secretary Chao's and applaud Secretary Chao's leadership in this arena. It's important for leaders to push on these issues across, in my view, across a partisan divide.
We have time for one last question. Any takers?
Take the last one. Angie Tang, Executive Director of the Committee 100. I'd like to go back to the discussion on China. Just last week, Pew published in your very well-known Global Attitudes Project that China has overtaken the U.S. as the world's #1 perceived economic power. And how would that perception, the rise of China, affect the perceptions of Asian Americans in the eyes of the general public in the U.S., and especially in the context of this political season when there's media campaign that portrays Asian Americans as foreigners, most notably connected with China?
The ad that the Michigan ad, what's his name? Extra, yeah. I mean, I think both parties should guard against ads like that, but that is a racist ad, and it should have been called out as a racist ad by people across the political spectrum. And there were a number of Republicans who called it a racist ad. I think I want to be clear. You can have concerns about China's economic policies and how they conduct their economic policies, and that is not anti-Chinese. But we have to guard against, especially in a political process and a political discussion, any blurring of those lines. And obviously, I thought that ad was not a blurring, but an obvious attempt to play on racial prejudices. And when we have a conversation about attitudes and diversity, et cetera, it's important that the broader, one of the challenges that we have is that, people worry, or my parents worry, that Asian Americans will get scapegoated in times of economic crisis. Now, I will note another poll that yesterday I believe there was a poll about the highest support for immigration in several years, and the highest levels of support for immigration during this economic crisis. But I do think that conversations about immigration have become very polarized and can become racialized in a way that I think, and I'm not saying they all are, it's not always like you can be worried about immigration policies and not be racist, but they can become racialized in a way that I think alienates subpopulations, and that we as leaders should guard against that as well.
There are unfortunate episodes
Yeah.
that occur with different racial groups. In the 1980s, it was the fear of Japan.
Right.
And it's a indictment upon people on both sides of the aisle.
Absolutely.
It was very xenophobic in 1980 as well, against a different population. I will respond to one point that Neera made. On the immigration issue, I think what's most important here is not the racialization. It's that legal versus illegal migration, which really divides the country. And so these are two different points of view as to what is really happening with the immigration debate.
And just on that point, I mean, I do think there was a Democrat, Blanche Lambert Lincoln, who ran an outsourcing ad in Arkansas. It was a flyer that was very, I said was anti-Indian, and I called her out on it. I mean, I don't mean to suggest it's just only happens in one party. She did take a lot of criticism from other Democrats. I do think it's important that we criticize that on both ends. So I completely agree with Secretary Chao that it's not just one party that we should be worried about.
Well, we don't have the time, but and this is not scripted, but I should just call out that the Committee 100 did do an attitudinal survey from the U.S. and China perspective in talking to both United States citizens and Chinese citizens about the U.S. and China perceptions. And there was some stark differences, so I would encourage people to go check out the Committee 100 website.
Good. Listen, we're very fortunate to have three such wonderful leaders talk about your experiences, the experiences of a community you know very well, and I think it's helping all of us understand the community better. So thanks for coming.
Thank you. Thanks for doing this.
Thank you.
Thank you. Pleasure.